aspiration. As I've been hinting, really what aspiration is a delay in the start of voicing. If this line represents the moment when the lips come apart, time along here, if we have a very big delay, that's heavy aspiration. So, ha, ha, ha. Not quite such a big delay. Ha, ha, ha. That's English style aspiration. Ha. There's still ha, ha. That's perhaps a slight aspiration. No aspiration. Ha, ha, ha. If the voicing starts before the lips separate, then we've got some pre-voicing. Ba, ba, ba. Or of course the voicing may go all the way through. Ba, ba. Or indeed from before the closure, ba, ba, ba. And this is a continuum. This is not a sequence of absolutely discrete steps. This is a continuum of possibilities. Different languages make different use of this continuum of possibilities. In French, Italian, Spanish, you really only exploit the bottom end here. And so you have a ba, da, ga, and a ba, da, ga. In Chinese, you exploit the top end of here. We have ta, ta, and we have ba, da. But we don't really have ba, da. In Thai, spoken in Thailand, they have three possibilities. They have ta, da, da, all three being different. Ta, aspirated, da, unaspirated but voiceless, da, voiced. So you see, different languages exploit this in different ways. And this can help us to see what happens in English in some cases about voiced consonants. Here's an example of a word, good, that begins and ends with plosives which we conventionally refer to as voiced. But that doesn't mean that we normally say such a word with voicing throughout. If I did that with voicing all the way through, it would be good, good, good. Not impossible, but it's not the way we usually say it. We normally say good, good, good. Now, this is because of the effects of the silence before and after. During silence, when you're saying nothing, the vocal folds, of course, are open. And it's like gradually getting yourself geared up into work. It doesn't happen instantaneously. It takes a moment to get the vocal folds working. Similarly, they know afterwards they're going to have to stop, and they anticipate this a bit. So we can say that silence smears into voicing. We get this initial and final tendency to devoice. Good, good. It's very dramatically seen on a spectrogram, and people who've been expecting to see full voicing in so-called voice consonants are often surprised and perhaps dismayed when they inspect a real spectrogram. This isn't a real spectrogram, this is a schematic diagram, but it shows the point. But in a word like good, it does in fact depend, if it's in the middle of a sentence, upon what the surrounding words are. If the surrounding sounds are voiceless, then this has the same effect as pause, as silence. So if we have the phrase this good sign, the s of this is voiceless, so there's a delay in starting the voicing quicker. And the s of sign is also voiceless, so the voicing switches off quite early. This good sign. On the other hand, if we have a good idea, now there it's surrounded by words which have voicing. Vowel, voiced. Idea begins with a vowel, voiced. So a good idea, voicing will normally continue throughout the whole thing. Because it's not a matter of switching it on or switching it off, it's just a matter of keeping it going. A good idea. Notice that in some languages, when you have voiceless S followed by voiced something, Some languages there's a tendency to assimilate voicing. And therefore, for a phrase like this good, to say this good, we don't do that in English. So, if your language is French or Dutch or one of the Slavonic languages that does have this tendency, please note we don't say it in English, it's striking in words like textbook. Text, voiceless, book, voiced. Mispronunciation, textbook, textbook, textbook. Correct pronunciation, textbook, textbook, textbook. English keeps voiceless sounds voiceless. The voiced, lenis obstruents, the g, are reliably voiced only when between other voiced sounds. That's what we had in a good idea. If they're not between voiced sounds, elsewhere then, they're usually devoiced. That is, there's little or no actual vibration of the vocal folds during their production. This is really why we often use these terms lenis and fortis, because we got embarrassed about saying voiced and voiceless because we know it's not actually quite true. So the terms lenis and fortis can be defined in a more general way so that they are true. Why doesn't a devoiced lenis, though, sound like a fortis if you take away the voicing from d? Why doesn't it sound like t? Well, obviously one reason is because it doesn't have aspiration. And indeed in English, it's probably the case that aspiration counts much more than actual voicing in knowing which sound is involved. If we've got a word like pin and bin, and we play to native speakers some kind of intermediate thing that doesn't have voicing, that doesn't have aspiration, they tend to hear it as being the B voiced one, because we react to lack of aspiration. Well, so that's one. We've also seen the effects of clipping, pre-fortis clipping, which we get before a fortis consonant, that's a voiceless one, but not, of course, before a voiced one. That's a lenis one, not necessarily voiced. Which means that if we have a word like rub, 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 we don't have to say it with full voicing. It wouldn't be normal to say rub, rub, but rub, rub. How we know it isn't a P? Well, you don't get the clipping effect on the vowel. There isn't the word rough, but there might be. If we take bad, how is bad different from bat? Bat has a shorter vowel because it's tipped before the T. Bad is rather longer. Bat may have a bit of this aspiration at the end. None at all, of course, in the case of it. The third bullet point, under 5, refers to something which I believe to be true, but which hasn't altogether been demonstrated yet in the laboratory. Well, everybody agrees that the lenis consonants seem to have less articulatory force. If we take the word touch, that ends in ch, touch, and compare with it the word judge, judge, which ends in the lenis, you could perhaps easily detect the forcefulness of the ch in touch, ch, 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 compared with the lack of force of the j in judge. It isn't actually voiced, okay, but it isn't ch, it's. And this is one of the things that is being referred to really when we say lenis is relatively weak force. How do we get this reduction in forcefulness? Well, I think that the probable reason is that the vocal folds in a devoiced lenis like this are not actually wider as they are in proper voiceless sounds, but they're in the narrowed whisper position. Now, is voiceless, is whisper. Can you hear the difference? Voiceless, whisper. In fact, when you whisper like this, you replace the voiced sounds with whispered sounds, and the voiceless ones remain voiceless. And even in whispering, able to perceive that difference in aspiration plus difference in forcefulness. So that's this less articulatory force that does seem to be the crucial and constant ingredient of the Linus series when compared with the Fortis series. Well, we've covered the various points we need to cover about voicing and aspiration. What I've had to say, of course, is in a sense annoying because we started with a nice simple definition, voiceless versus voiced, and we've now complicated it by bringing in aspiration, seeing that, well, even aspiration doesn't always apply, and sometimes voiced things aren't really voiced. We get these effects of the context. Then we've got articulatory force. Nevertheless, the starting point is correct from the linguistic point of view, because linguistically we have to distinguish between one set and the other set, and that's the most important thing. Notice that in the position after S, where we saw there was no aspiration, spin, this is also a position where there's no actual contrast of voicing. Although we distinguish pin from bin, we don't distinguish spin from any other candidate. We could write it with a B, S-B-I-N, and it wouldn't cause confusion. So in a sense, the phonetic facts parallel the linguistic facts. At the bottom of the sheet, point 6, I've listed some of the particular kinds of problem that I'm aware of, depending on language and so on. Interference from the first language. So first of all, some languages don't really have any voiced obstruents. Chinese, for example, which doesn't matter too much as long as you keep them Linus, but it's possibly worthwhile practicing making them voiced between vowels. Words like labour, meter, well, which should be voiced throughout rather than labour. Second bullet point, gemination. I haven't really talked about gemination. Gemination is double consonants. Although we write two letters P in the word happy, we don't say happy. We say happy. Single quick consonant. However, many Japanese learners, when the P is at the end of a word, or the end of a morpheme, tend to make it too long and sort of doubled. So instead of saying shop, we get shop, shop, with an extra long P. And instead of going shopping, going shopping. That's not appropriate, so we have to reduce it in duration to a single type of P. Aspiration, well, we've already noted that various languages don't have aspiration, so they may have to practice doing aspiration. Tip, tip. Some other languages perhaps have rather too much aspiration, because they're at the top of that continuum diagram I showed you, rather than one stage below the top. Koreans have very heavy aspiration, and it's not appropriate in English to say pin rather than pin, just a bit of aspiration. Failure to distinguish the fricatives from one another, particularly s, which is a problem for Spanish and for the Scandinavian languages. And a general problem with making the contrast of voicing in positions other than initial, so in the middle of a word, simple symbol, or at the end of a word, back, back. And that can be a problem for those whose languages don't have consonants in those positions or don't have the distinction of voicing in that position. It's also a problem with speakers of German, Polish, Russian and so on, but on the whole, in my experience, that is well taught in schools, so that at my level I never come across speakers of those languages who can't make this distinction in final position, whereas I do sometimes for some other languages. And with that, we've got to the end of voicing and aspiration.